The Bennett family reunion was in full swing when my husband Will casually announced he was leaving me stranded 3 hours from home to spend the weekend with his work colleague Claudia. As the entire family watched him walk away without a backward glance, I smiled and pulled out my phone. "Well, since Will won't be needing a ride home," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I guess this is the perfect time to share those photos I've been saving. The ones showing exactly what kind of works he's been doing with Claudia." The silence that followed was deafening. Let me paint you the picture of how I ended up holding a phone full of evidence while standing in the middle of the most humiliating moment of my marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Bennett family reunion happens every August at Grandma Bennett's sprawling property in rural Georgia, 60 acres of farmland that's been in the family for 4 generations. Picture white tents scattered across emerald grass, picnic tables groaning under the weight of Southern comfort food, and approximately 75 family members ranging from toddlers to great-grandparents, all gathered to celebrate another year of Bennett family unity. I'm Penelope Bennett, or at least I was that day, 32 years old, married to Will Bennett for 6 years, and until 3 months ago, I believed I was living a fairly predictable but happy life. Will and I had met during our senior year at the University of Georgia. He was studying business, I was finishing my degree in graphic design. We'd built what I thought was a solid marriage based on shared values, mutual respect, and genuine affection. Will worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, a job that required frequent travel but paid well enough for us to buy a lovely craftsman house in Marietta, just outside Atlanta. I ran a small but successful freelance design business from our home office, creating marketing materials for local businesses, and occasionally landing larger contracts with regional corporations. Our life wasn't glamorous, but it was comfortable, stable, and filled with the kind of everyday happiness that makes you believe in forever. Or so I thought. The trouble began in May, 3 months before this family reunion that would become my personal ground zero. Will had started talking about a new colleague named Claudia, who had joined his sales team. At first, the mentions were casual. Claudia suggested a new approach to the hospital accounts, or Claudia and I are working late to finish the quarterly reports. Normal workplace collaboration, or so it seemed. But as the weeks progressed, Claudia's name began appearing in our conversations with increasing frequency. "Claudia thinks we should try that new restaurant downtown. Claudia mentioned she loves hiking. Maybe we should plan a weekend trip. Claudia has this theory about work-life balance that really makes sense." I found myself feeling like a third wheel in conversations about my own husband's life. More troubling was how Will's entire demeanor changed when he talked about her. His voice became more animated, his eyes brighter. He displayed an enthusiasm I hadn't seen from him in years, certainly not when he talked about our own plans or dreams. The red flags started as tiny pinpricks of unease that I initially dismissed as paranoia. Will began working later, claiming important projects with tight deadlines. His weekend work calls became more frequent and lasted longer. He'd step out onto our back porch for these conversations, speaking in hushed tones that carried just enough to let me know he was discussing more than quarterly sales figures. His appearance started changing too, subtle improvements that he attributed to wanting to make a good impression on the new team. New cologne, more expensive shirts, a sudden interest in fitness that led to a gym membership he'd been avoiding for years. When I complimented these changes, he'd deflect with comments about professional development and company image. The most telling change was in his treatment of me, not cruel or obviously neglectful, but distant, preoccupied, like I was a familiar piece of furniture he'd grown so accustomed to that he barely registered my presence. Our conversations became increasingly superficial, logistics about schedules, bills, and household maintenance. The deeper connections, the intimate late-night talks that had once defined our relationship, simply evaporated. The moment that shattered my willful ignorance happened on a Tuesday evening in early July. Will had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he showered, something that had never bothered either of us before. We'd always had an open device policy in our marriage, no passwords, no hidden screens, complete transparency born from complete trust. A notification popped up from Instagram, and I glanced over casually, expecting to see a work-related message or a post from one of his college friends. Instead, I saw a direct message preview from an account named Claudia M_Adventures. The visible text read, "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about." My blood went cold. With trembling fingers, I clicked on the conversation thread, and my entire world collapsed in the span of 30 seconds. Months of messages, photos of romantic dinners I'd never attended, pictures of weekend getaways during Will's supposed business trips, images of hotel rooms, wine glasses, and intimate moments that should have belonged to us. But the most devastating discovery wasn't the evidence of their affair. It was the casual cruelty with which they discussed me. Screenshots of text conversations where Will complained about my boring personality, my lack of ambition, my clingy behavior. Messages where Claudia made jokes about the wife who doesn't understand him, and suggestions for lies Will could tell to spend more time with her. As I sat in our kitchen that night, staring at irrefutable proof of my husband's betrayal, the family reunion invitation felt like a cosmic joke. The cheerful yellow cardstock announced Bennett Family Reunion 2024, celebrating family love and unity, with hand-drawn hearts and Will's grandmother's elegant script promising a weekend of memories to last a lifetime. Will had been enthusiastic about attending, which now made perfect sense. The reunion would provide the perfect cover for whatever he had planned with Claudia. He could claim family obligations while actually arranging a romantic weekend getaway. The thought of him using his own family's celebration as an alibi for his affair made my stomach turn. But as I sat there in the darkness of our kitchen, surrounded by the debris of my shattered marriage, a different kind of clarity began to emerge. If Will wanted to use the family reunion as his stage, then I would make sure it became exactly that, a stage where the truth would finally be revealed. That night, as Will slept peacefully beside me, completely unaware that his secret life had been exposed, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't confront him privately. I wouldn't give him the opportunity to gaslight me, to minimize his actions, or to craft some elaborate explanation that would make me question my own sanity. Instead, I would let him walk into his own trap. I would attend the family reunion, smile and play the perfect wife, and wait for the moment when his arrogance would give me the opening I needed. Because I had something Will didn't know about, months of evidence, carefully documented and saved. Photos, messages, receipts, and a timeline that painted a picture so clear that no amount of charm or manipulation could explain it away. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. Will Bennett thought he was clever, thought he could have his cake and eat it too. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. The Bennett family reunion was going to be memorable, all right, just not in the way anyone expected. To understand the magnitude of what I discovered that July evening, you need to understand who Will Bennett was, or at least, who everyone believed him to be. In the Bennett family hierarchy, Will occupied a special position as the responsible middle child who'd always done everything right, while his older brother Spencer had spent his 20s traveling the world and changing careers every few years, and his younger sister Julie had married young and divorced even younger. Will had followed the prescribed path to success with mathematical precision. Will graduated summa cum laude from UGA's business school, landed his first job before graduation, and worked his way up through 3 pharmaceutical companies over 8 years to reach his current position as regional sales director for Medcore Solutions. He was the Bennett family success story, the son who remembered birthdays, contributed generously to family financial emergencies, and never missed a holiday gathering. At family events, Will was always the one organizing group photos, mediating cousin disputes, and ensuring his grandmother had everything she needed. He'd volunteer to fix leaky faucets, move furniture, and drive elderly relatives to doctor's appointments. The perfect son, the dependable brother, the husband other Bennett wives held up as an example to their own husbands. "Why can't you be more like Will?" became such a common refrain at family gatherings that it turned into a running joke. Will would just smile modestly and deflect attention, making self-deprecating comments about being boring or predictable. The family ate it up. Will Bennett, humble, reliable, devoted to family values. For 6 years, Will and I had been the Bennett family's golden couple. We were the ones who arrived early to help set up, stayed late to clean up, and never forgot to bring exactly what we'd been asked to contribute. At Christmas, we coordinated our gifts to avoid duplicates. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At weddings, we were the couple other relatives pointed to when giving relationship advice to younger family members. "Look at Will and Penelope," Aunt Carla would say, clutching her wine glass at family barbecues. 6 years married and they still hold hands. They still laugh at each other's jokes. That's how you know it's real love. The irony wasn't lost on me now. We had held hands because Will was always conscious of appearances. We did laugh at each other's jokes because Will had a well-developed sense of what looked good to an audience. Every gesture of affection, every loving glance, every sweet comment had been perfectly calculated to maintain our image as the couple who'd figured it all out. I genuinely believed in our happiness, but looking back with new eyes, I could see how much of our relationship had been performance. Will was naturally charming, effortlessly likable, and skilled at reading what people wanted to see. He'd simply applied those same talents to our marriage, giving me just enough attention and affection to keep me content while reserving his real passion for elsewhere. As for me, I'd found my place in the Bennett family ecosystem as the supportive wife who made Will look even better. I was the one who remembered to send get-well cards when family members were sick, who organized surprise parties for milestone birthdays, and who could be counted on to bring homemade desserts to every gathering. My graphic design skills had been put to work creating family newsletters, reunion invitations, and memorial programs when relatives passed away. I'd photographed dozens of family events, creating scrapbooks and photo albums that documented the Bennett family history. I'd become the unofficial family chronicler, always behind the camera, always capturing everyone else's special moments. The family appreciated me, but in the way you appreciate a helpful service provider. I was useful, pleasant, and undemanding. I never caused drama, never competed for attention, and never challenged the established family dynamics. I was Will's wife, and that defined my entire identity within the family structure. The Bennett family operated on a complex system of unspoken rules and established hierarchies. Will's father, Anthony, was the patriarch, a retired insurance executive who'd built the family's comfortable middle-class lifestyle through decades of careful financial planning. His word was law, though he rarely needed to assert his authority directly. Will's mother, Julie Sr., named after her daughter, was the family's emotional center. She managed all social obligations, remembered every important date, and served as the communication hub for family news. Julie Sr. had always liked me, but in a distant, polite way. I was good enough for Will, which meant I was acceptable, but I'd never crossed the threshold into truly belonging. Spencer, the eldest son, lived in Denver with his third serious girlfriend in 5 years. He worked in renewable energy consulting and made good money, but his lifestyle choices, no marriage, no children, no mortgage, kept him on the periphery of family approval. He was loved but not quite respected. Julie Jr. had returned to her maiden name after her divorce, and was raising twin boys as a single mother while working as a nurse. She lived in a small apartment 20 minutes from the family home, and relied heavily on her parents for childcare support. Her divorce had been messy, public, and embarrassing for the family, which had demoted her from favored daughter to cautionary tale. Then there was Will, steady, successful, married to the right kind of woman, living the right kind of life. He was the family's pride and joy, the proof that their values and expectations produced success. The Bennett family reunion wasn't just immediate family, it was a sprawling network of aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who'd been honorary relatives for decades. These gatherings could include anywhere from 60 to 80 people, all connected by blood, marriage, or long-standing friendship. There was Uncle Dexter, Anthony's brother, who owned a successful plumbing business, and never missed an opportunity to discuss the superiority of American-made pipe fittings. His wife, Aunt Patricia, collected vintage dishes and insisted on using only family china for reunion meals, despite the logistical nightmare of feeding 80 people with inherited serving pieces. Cousin Marcus brought his guitar every year and led sing-alongs around the evening bonfire. Cousin Sarah, not to be confused with 3 other Sarahs in the extended family, organized the annual family talent show that no one wanted to participate in, but everyone felt obligated to attend. These were the people who would witness whatever happened at this year's reunion. These were the people whose opinions mattered to Will, whose approval he'd spent his entire life cultivating. These were the people who knew him as the golden boy, the success story, the one who'd never disappointed anyone. What struck me most as I planned my strategy was how invisible I'd become within this family system. I was present at every gathering, involved in every tradition, but I'd never been central to anything. I was Will's wife, Spencer's sister-in-law, Julie Sr.'s daughter-in-law, but never just Penelope. This invisibility had bothered me occasionally over the years, but I'd always attributed it to being naturally introverted, to needing time to fully belong to such an established family group. Now I realized it was something else entirely. I'd been relegated to the background, because that's where Will needed me to be. A wife who was too dynamic, too independent, or too attention-grabbing, might have interfered with Will's position as the family favorite. A wife who challenged him, questioned him, or outshone him in any way would have complicated his carefully maintained image. I'd been selected, consciously or unconsciously, because I was safe, because I would never be a threat to his status or his ego. But that same invisibility, that had marginalized me for 6 years, was about to become my greatest weapon. Because people who are invisible observe things that others miss, they notice patterns, contradictions, and truths that everyone else is too busy or self-absorbed to see. And I'd been watching very carefully indeed. What Will Bennett didn't realize about his wife was that I wasn't just a freelance graphic designer who occasionally created brochures for local restaurants and real estate agents. My business, Meridian Creative Solutions, had grown far beyond the small-scale projects I discussed at dinner parties. Over the past 3 years, I'd been working with corporate clients on comprehensive digital investigations, tracking down copyright infringement, documenting intellectual property theft, and gathering evidence for litigation support. You see, graphic design in the digital age isn't just about making things look pretty, it's about understanding how images move through online spaces, how metadata reveals location and timing information, and how to trace the digital footprints that people leave behind without even realizing it. I developed expertise in digital forensics that most people assumed was purely technical work done by specialists in government agencies. My specialty was corporate espionage cases, situations where companies suspected employees of selling secrets to competitors or using company resources for personal gain. I'd learned to follow money trails through social media posts, identify relationships through image analysis, and document patterns of behavior that revealed deception. Lawyers paid me very well for these skills, but I'd never mentioned this work to Will because I thought he'd find it boring. How wrong I was about what would prove boring to him. The morning after discovering Will's Instagram messages, I sat in my home office staring at my computer screen with entirely new eyes. The skills I'd been using to catch corporate cheaters were about to be applied to my own marriage. I opened a new case file on my secure drive and labeled it Project Bennett. First, I created a comprehensive timeline using specialized software I'd purchased for client work. Every business trip, every late night, every weekend emergency was plotted against Claudia's social media activity. The pattern that emerged was damning in its precision. Will's overnight conference in Birmingham corresponded perfectly with Claudia's Instagram story from a luxury hotel in the same city. His client dinner that ran late aligned with her Facebook check-in at an upscale steakhouse across town. But the real goldmine was in the metadata. Every photo Claudia posted contained embedded information about when and where it was taken. The romantic sunset dinner she'd shared on June 15th, the embedded GPS coordinates placed it at a restaurant in Savannah. The same day, Will claimed to be in a day-long meeting with hospital administrators. The hiking trip she'd documented in early July. The location data showed it was taken at Amicalola Falls. During the weekend, Will told me he was attending a mandatory compliance training session. I began methodically screenshotting everything, but I didn't stop at just saving the images. Using professional-grade software, I documented the metadata for each photo, creating an unshakable timeline of their relationship. Every romantic getaway, every intimate dinner, every stolen weekend was now documented with scientific precision. My corporate investigation experience had taught me that emotional affairs always leave financial trails. I'd learned to follow money because money doesn't lie the way people do. Over the next week, I conducted a forensic review of our joint accounts, credit card statements, and Will's expense reports. The evidence was stunning in its audacity. Will had been using our joint credit card to pay for his affair, then categorizing the expenses as legitimate business costs for reimbursement. The romantic dinner in Savannah, submitted as a client entertainment expense. The luxury hotel in Birmingham, filed as conference accommodation. The expensive jewelry I'd found charged to our Visa, listed as a corporate gift for key account management. Will wasn't just cheating on me, he was stealing from both me and his company to fund his betrayal. Each receipt told a story of calculated deception, and I documented every transaction with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant. By the end of the week, I had proof that Will had fraudulently claimed over $12,000 in fake business expenses to pay for his affair. Claudia's social media presence revealed she was either incredibly naive about digital privacy or completely confident that no one would investigate her online activity. Her Instagram account was public, her Facebook settings allowed friends of friends to see her posts, and her LinkedIn profile painted a picture of ambitious professionalism that stood in stark contrast to her willingness to involve herself with a married colleague. But it was her Twitter account that provided the most damaging evidence. Claudia apparently used Twitter as her personal diary, posting cryptic but revealing updates about her emotional state. Sometimes the best things are worth waiting for, even when they're complicated. From March 15th. Business trips are so much better with good company. From April 3rd. Watching someone choose between old habits and new happiness. From May 20th. Each tweet could be correlated with Will's travel schedule or significant events in our marriage. The May 20th post, for instance, came the day after our 6th wedding anniversary, a dinner that Will had seemed distracted and disengaged throughout. Reading her words, I realized she'd been watching our marriage dissolve in real time and celebrating each step of its destruction. What gave me a significant advantage in gathering evidence was my professional-grade equipment and software. While most people take screenshots with their phones and hope for the best, I was creating forensically sound documentation that would hold up in legal proceedings. I used specialized programs to capture not just images, but the complete source code of web pages, ensuring that even if Claudia deleted her posts, I would have permanent records. I'd also invested in social media monitoring software for my business clients, programs that could track changes to profiles, alert me to new posts, and create automatic backups of content. I set up monitoring for both Will's and Claudia's social media accounts, creating a comprehensive surveillance system that documented their digital relationship in real time. My home office, which Will saw as my little hobby space where I played with design projects, was actually equipped with the kind of investigation technology that private investigators and corporate security firms paid thousands of dollars to access. I had database access for reverse image searching, professional-grade photo analysis software, and secure cloud storage systems that could maintain legal evidence chains. Within 2 weeks of beginning my investigation, I had assembled a comprehensive file that documented not just Will's affair, but the systematic way he'd been deceiving everyone in his life. The evidence fell into several categories: financial fraud against both our marriage and his employer, extensive documentation of the emotional and physical affair, proof of lies told to family and friends, and a timeline that showed the deliberate, calculated nature of his deception. But I didn't stop at just documenting the affair itself. I began investigating Claudia's background, her employment history, and her own social connections. What I discovered was that this wasn't her first workplace romance. Her LinkedIn profile showed a pattern of job changes that corresponded with relationship complications at previous companies. She'd left 2 previous positions under circumstances that suggested personal relationships had interfered with professional responsibilities. This information became crucial because it revealed that Will wasn't the victim of an unexpected attraction or workplace chemistry gone wrong. He'd been specifically targeted by someone who had a history of pursuing married colleagues. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage, it was a calculated seduction by someone who specialized in exactly this kind of manipulation. My experience with litigation support had taught me the importance of legal preparation from the very beginning of an investigation. I consulted with a forensic accountant who specialized in divorce cases, ensuring that my financial documentation would meet legal standards. I worked with a technology consultant to verify that my digital evidence would be admissible in court proceedings. Most importantly, I began working with a private investigator who could supplement my digital evidence with physical surveillance. While I could document their online relationship and financial improprieties, I needed professional help to gather evidence of their physical meetings and establish the full scope of their deception. The private investigator, a former police detective named Marcus Riley, was impressed by the quality and thoroughness of my digital investigation. Most people come to me with suspicions, and maybe a few screenshots, he told me during our initial consultation. You've built a case that's already courtroom ready. My job is just to fill in the gaps. Perhaps the most important discovery during this investigation phase wasn't about Will's betrayal, it was about my own strength. As I methodically documented each lie, each deception, each cruel comment about our marriage, I found myself becoming emotionally detached from the pain of discovery. The systematic nature of building a case created a protective barrier between my heart and the devastating reality of what I was uncovering. I wasn't just a betrayed wife anymore. I was a skilled investigator gathering evidence against a target who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating his opponent. Will saw me as a harmless designer who spent her days choosing fonts and color schemes. He had no idea he was living with someone who could dismantle his life with the same precision he'd used to destroy our marriage. And that, I realized, was going to be his downfall. 3 weeks into my investigation, I uncovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about Will's affair. While reviewing his company expense reports with forensic precision, I discovered that the fraudulent submissions weren't just recent additions to cover his relationship with Claudia. They went back almost 2 years, predating Claudia's employment at MedCore Solutions by 6 months. Will had been systematically defrauding his company long before he met his current mistress. The expensive dinners, luxury hotel stays, and weekend getaways that I'd attributed to his affair with Claudia were actually part of a much larger pattern of financial manipulation. My husband wasn't just an unfaithful spouse, he was a career criminal who'd been embezzling company funds for years. This revelation led me down a rabbit hole that completely redefined my understanding of the man I'd married. Using the same digital investigation techniques I employed for corporate clients, I began tracing Will's financial history back to the beginning of our marriage. What I found was a systematic pattern of deception that made his affair look like a minor character flaw. The evidence painted a picture of escalating fraud that began small and grew progressively bolder. In our first year of marriage, Will had submitted a handful of questionable expense reports, client dinners that seemed unusually expensive, conference fees that didn't quite match the official registration costs. I'd noticed these discrepancies when helping him organize our tax documents, but he'd explained them as simple accounting errors or upgraded service levels. By year 2, the fraudulent expenses had increased in both frequency and dollar amount. Will was claiming reimbursement for weekend trips that he told me were mandatory training sessions, but the hotel receipts showed luxury accommodations far beyond what any pharmaceutical company would approve for staff education. When I'd asked about the fancy hotels, he'd claimed they were the only venues available on short notice. Year 3 brought a sophisticated evolution in his fraud methodology. Will had learned to split large expenses across multiple categories, making the individual items less likely to trigger accounting reviews. A single weekend affair would be broken down into separate claims for meals, transportation, accommodation, and client entertainment, with each submission falling just below the threshold that required additional approval. By year 4, Will had developed relationships with certain vendors who were willing to provide inflated receipts in exchange for consistent business. A restaurant that should have charged $200 for dinner would provide a receipt for $400, with Will pocketing the difference in cash. Hotel managers would upgrade his rooms for free while charging the company premium rates. He'd created an entire network of enablers who helped him steal thousands of dollars each month. The most shocking discovery wasn't the amount Will had stolen, though the figure exceeded $80,000 over 5 years. It was the systematic way he'd used our marriage as cover for his criminal activity. Every family vacation we'd taken had been partially funded by stolen money. The down payment on our house had included fraudulent reimbursements. Even the engagement ring he'd given me had been purchased with money embezzled from his employer. Our entire life together was built on a foundation of theft and deception. The comfortable lifestyle I'd attributed to Will's success in pharmaceutical sales was actually the result of elaborate financial fraud. We weren't living the American dream, we were living off the proceeds of criminal activity. But the betrayal went deeper than money. Will had involved me unknowingly in his criminal enterprise. He'd used our joint accounts to process the fraudulent reimbursements, making me an unwitting accomplice to money laundering. He'd claimed some of my legitimate business expenses as his own, stealing both from his company and from my tax deductions. He'd even forged my signature on documents when he needed a spouse's authorization for certain financial transactions. My investigation revealed that Will's fraudulent activities extended beyond simple expense manipulation. He'd been working with a network of other sales representatives to share vendor contacts, coordinate fraudulent billing schemes, and cover for each other's suspicious activities. This wasn't a lone wolf operation. It was an organized conspiracy involving multiple employees across several pharmaceutical companies. The group had developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection. They rotated which team members would submit large expense claims, ensuring that no individual appeared to be an outlier. They'd identified accounting personnel who were more lenient in their review processes and timed their submissions to coincide with busy periods when scrutiny would be minimal. They even had a system for sharing information about internal audits and compliance reviews. Most disturbing was the discovery that this network had been operating for years, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from multiple companies while maintaining their reputations as top performers. Will wasn't just a cheating husband who'd gotten greedy, he was a career criminal who'd built his professional success on systematic theft. What gave me access to this level of detailed information was the same digital forensics expertise that Will had consistently underestimated. While he saw me as a simple graphic designer, I'd actually developed sophisticated skills in financial investigation and digital evidence gathering. The corporate clients who paid me premium rates for litigation support weren't hiring me to create pretty presentations. They were paying for the kind of forensic analysis that could expose complex fraud schemes. My home office contained software that could analyze metadata in financial documents, trace digital signatures, and identify patterns in electronic communications. I had access to databases that could verify vendor information, cross-reference expense submissions, and flag suspicious financial activities. Will had been living with someone who possessed exactly the skills needed to uncover his criminal enterprise, and he'd never realized the danger. The irony was overwhelming. While Will was lying about his business trips and covering his tracks with fake receipts, I was literally being paid to catch people who engaged in exactly the same behavior. Every technique he'd used to hide his fraud, I'd seen before. Every excuse he'd made for suspicious expenses, I'd heard from other criminals. He'd married his worst nightmare and never even known it. As the scope of Will's criminal activity became clear, I realized that my evidence gathering had evolved far beyond preparing for a divorce. I was now documenting federal crimes that could result in decades of prison time. Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and embezzlement charges would likely follow if this information reached the proper authorities. The decision about what to do with this evidence would ultimately determine not just the end of our marriage, but the rest of Will's life. I held documentation that could send him to federal prison and destroy any possibility of his maintaining his professional career or family relationships. The power I'd gained through this investigation was far greater than I'd ever imagined when I first discovered his affair. But more importantly, I'd learned something crucial about the upcoming family reunion. Will's plan to abandon me there wasn't just about spending time with Claudia. It was part of a larger exit strategy. My investigation had revealed that he'd been preparing to leave his job, liquidate his assets, and disappear with his stolen money. The reunion was meant to be his final performance as the perfect family man before he vanished into a new life funded by 5 years of embezzlement. By the end of July, 3 weeks before the family reunion, I possessed a complete picture of Will's double life. He wasn't just having an affair. he was planning to abandon everything and everyone who'd ever trusted him. His theft from the company, his betrayal of our marriage, and his deception of his family were all part of a comprehensive plan to escape accountability and start over with his stolen wealth. The family reunion represented his final goodbye, though no one else would recognize it as such. He would play the role of devoted son and perfect family man one last time, then disappear into a new identity with Claudia and their stolen fortune. In his mind, he was already gone. The reunion was just his farewell performance. But Will had made one critical miscalculation. He'd underestimated the woman he'd married, and that mistake was about to cost him everything. Because while he'd been planning his escape, I'd been building a trap, and the family reunion that was supposed to be his triumphant exit was about to become the scene of his complete destruction. The perfect crime was about to meet the perfect investigator, and I had home field advantage. The moment that transformed me from passive observer to active participant in my own life happened on a sweltering Thursday evening in early August, exactly 2 weeks before the family reunion. I was in our kitchen preparing dinner when Will's phone rang with a call that would become the catalyst for everything that followed. Will was in the shower, and his phone was charging on the kitchen counter where he'd left it after arriving home from work. When it started ringing, I glanced over casually, expecting to see his mother's name or perhaps a colleague with a last-minute work question. Instead, the screen displayed Claudia, with a heart emoji, a contact entry that definitely hadn't existed the last time I'd seen his phone. The audacity of it took my breath away. Not only was he carrying on an affair, but he'd become so comfortable with his deception that he was now saving his mistress's contact information with romantic symbols. In our shared home, on a phone that I occasionally used to check the time or look up restaurant numbers when we were deciding where to eat. The call went to voicemail, but 30 seconds later, a text message appeared on the lock screen preview: emergency at work. Need to talk. Call me back ASAP. When Will emerged from the bathroom 15 minutes later, I watched him check his phone with the studied attention of a behavioral analyst. His face went through a carefully controlled series of expressions: surprise, concern, and then determination. He was preparing to lie to me, and I was watching him construct the deception in real time. "Honey," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of regret. "I just got a call from the office. There's a major crisis with the Riverside Hospital account. Apparently, their head of purchasing has some serious concerns about our contract renewal, and if we don't address them immediately, we could lose a $2.3 million account." I continued stirring the pasta sauce, maintaining the facade of the trusting wife, while internally cataloging every element of his performance. The specific dollar amount was a nice touch, precise enough to sound convincing, large enough to justify urgency. The mention of a head of purchasing provided an official-sounding authority figure who would presumably be unavailable for verification. "Oh no," I replied with practiced sympathy. "What do you need to do?" "Claudia and I are going to have to drive down to Macon tonight for an emergency meeting first thing tomorrow morning. The purchasing director can only meet with us before his regularly scheduled Friday appointments, so we need to be there by 7 a.m. Notice, I thought, how smoothly he integrated Claudia into the business justification. Not "I need to drive to Macon" or "the company is sending someone to Macon," but specifically Claudia and I. He was establishing her presence in the narrative from the beginning, making it seem natural and necessary rather than suspicious. "Will you be back tomorrow night?" I asked, continuing to play my role while internally recording every detail of his lie. "Probably not until Saturday afternoon," Will replied, moving into our bedroom to pack an overnight bag. "After the morning meeting, we need to tour their facilities, review their current inventory management systems, and probably take the department heads out for dinner to smooth over any relationship issues. You know how these hospital accounts are, everything is about relationships and FaceTime." I followed him into the bedroom, watching as he packed clothes that were notably nicer than what he typically wore for actual business trips. The silk tie I'd given him for our anniversary. The expensive cologne he usually saved for special occasions. The Italian leather shoes that had cost more than some people's car payments. "It sounds like a really important account," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "I hope you can save it." "Oh, we will," Will replied with confidence. "Claudia is brilliant with relationship management. She has this way of reading people and knowing exactly what they need to hear. The hospital administrators love her. The casual praise for Claudia's professional abilities made my stomach turn, but it also provided valuable insight into how Will rationalized his affair. He'd convinced himself that his attraction to her was based on professional admiration, that their relationship was built on shared competence rather than mutual deception. "There's just one thing," Will said, pausing in his packing. "I know we're supposed to go to Mom and Dad's on Saturday for dinner before the reunion. Do you think you could handle that alone and make some excuse for me? I really don't want to disappoint them, but this crisis came out of nowhere." This request revealed the true scope of Will's planning. He wasn't just arranging a romantic weekend with Claudia, he was systematically extracting himself from family obligations and social commitments. The dinner at his parents' house was a tradition we'd maintained throughout our marriage, a weekly connection that reinforced our status as the perfect couple within the Bennett family structure. "Of course," I said. "I'll tell them you're still dealing with the hospital situation. They'll understand that work comes first sometimes." "You're amazing," Will said, kissing my cheek with what seemed like genuine gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you covering for me like this." The irony was so profound it took my breath away. Will was expressing sincere appreciation for my willingness to enable his betrayal. He was genuinely grateful that I was making it easier for him to lie to his family and spend romantic weekends with another woman. As I stood in our bedroom watching my husband pack for a weekend with his mistress while thanking me for my support, something shifted inside me that was deeper than anger or hurt. It was a crystalline moment of absolute clarity about who Will really was and what our marriage had always been. I realized that I'd never actually been his wife in any meaningful sense. I'd been his enabler, his cover story, his alibi. My loyalty, my trust, and my love hadn't been cherished, they'd been exploited. Every time I'd covered for his late nights, made excuses for his absences, or smoothed over his social obligations, I'd been unknowingly facilitating his double life. Will didn't just not love me, he actively depended on my naivety to maintain his deception. My trusting nature wasn't something he appreciated, it was a resource he mined for his own convenience. The better wife I tried to be, the easier I made it for him to betray me. In that moment, standing in our bedroom while Will packed for his romantic getaway, I made a decision that would determine everything that happened at the family reunion. I wouldn't confront him about the affair, I wouldn't demand explanations or ultimatums, I wouldn't give him any indication that his deception had been discovered. Instead, I would let him go to Macon, I would let him have his romantic weekend with Claudia, I would attend dinner at his parents' house alone and make convincing excuses for his absence. I would play the role of understanding wife one more time. Because I now understood something that Will had failed to grasp, his overconfidence was his weakness. He'd become so comfortable with lying to me that he'd stopped being careful about the details. He'd grown so accustomed to my support that he'd begun to take it for granted. His belief that I was too trusting and naive to discover his deception had made him careless. That Saturday evening, I sat at Anthony and Julie Sr.'s dining room table, maintaining perfect composure while explaining Will's absence to his parents. "He's so frustrated about missing dinner," I said, helping myself to Julie Sr.'s famous pot roast. "But you know how he is about work commitments. He couldn't live with himself if he let down a major client." "That's our Will," Anthony said proudly. "Always putting his responsibilities first. That's the kind of work ethic that builds a successful career." Julie Sr. nodded approvingly. "And you're so understanding about it, Penelope. Some wives would complain about their husbands working weekends, but you've always supported Will's ambitions." I smiled graciously, accepting their praise for being the perfect wife, while knowing that at that exact moment, Will was probably sharing a candlelit dinner with Claudia in some romantic restaurant, using stolen money to pay for their meal, while I maintained his reputation with his family. The weekend Will spent in Macon provided the final piece of evidence I needed for my plan. While he was gone, I used his absence to conduct a thorough search of our home office, looking for any physical evidence I might have missed in my digital investigation. Hidden in a folder labeled Tax Documents 2023, I found printed copies of hotel receipts, restaurant bills, and travel confirmations that documented not just his recent affair with Claudia, but his entire pattern of deception over the past 5 years. Will had been keeping physical backup records of his fraudulent activities, apparently as insurance against potential computer failures or audit requests. These documents provided the missing link between his financial crimes and his personal betrayals. They proved that his theft hadn't begun with his affair. His affair had simply given him more creative ways to spend stolen money. They also revealed the scope of his planned escape, showing reservations and deposits for a luxury apartment in another city, scheduled to begin the Monday after the family reunion. Will's plan was now completely clear. The family reunion was his farewell performance, his final appearance as the devoted son and perfect husband. After that weekend, he intended to disappear with Claudia and their stolen fortune, leaving me to deal with the financial and legal consequences of his crimes. But as I sat in our home office, surrounded by evidence of his comprehensive betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Because Will's plan had one fatal flaw that his arrogance had prevented him from seeing. He'd underestimated the woman he'd married, and that mistake was about to destroy him. Following Will's weekend trip to Macon, I implemented a comprehensive evidence-gathering strategy that would make my case irrefutable. My professional experience had taught me that emotional testimony, no matter how compelling, could always be dismissed or rationalized. But financial records, GPS data, and photographic evidence created an undeniable narrative that no amount of charm or manipulation could overcome. I established a secure digital workspace using the same protocols I employed for high-stakes corporate litigation. Everything was time-stamped, verified, and stored with multiple backup systems. If Will's criminal network was sophisticated, my documentation process was going to be bulletproof. The first phase involved creating a comprehensive digital timeline that correlated Will's claimed business activities with his actual whereabouts. Using geolocation data from his social media check-ins, credit card transaction locations, and cellular tower ping records I could access through my investigative software, I mapped his real movements against his reported schedule. The results were devastating. Will's mandatory training weekend in Nashville actually placed him at a luxury resort in Asheville with Claudia. His client emergency in Jacksonville showed transactions at romantic restaurants in Savannah. Every business trip had been a lie, and every lie was now documented with scientific precision. My background in corporate fraud investigation had taught me that money always tells the truth. While people can lie convincingly about their emotions, their motivations, and their intentions, financial transactions create an objective record that can't be manipulated after the fact. I conducted a forensic analysis of every financial account Will had access to, including several I discovered that he'd hidden from me. Using specialized software, designed for divorce attorneys and fraud investigators, I traced the flow of money from his fraudulent expense reimbursements through our joint accounts and into a web of secret credit cards and offshore savings accounts. Will had been more systematic in his financial planning than I'd initially realized. He hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been building a sophisticated exit strategy that would allow him to disappear with substantial assets, while leaving me legally responsible for debts and obligations I knew nothing about. The most shocking discovery was a secret credit line he'd opened using our house as collateral. Will had borrowed $75,000 against our home equity without my knowledge, despite the fact that my name was on the deed. The money had been funneled into accounts I couldn't access, essentially stealing my share of our home's value to fund his planned escape. While conducting physical surveillance was beyond my capabilities, digital monitoring was well within my professional skill set. I deployed the same social media tracking systems I used for corporate clients to create comprehensive profiles of both Will and Claudia's online activities. The software I used could capture deleted posts, track private message activity, and identify connections between different social media platforms. Within days, I had access to conversations, photos, and planning documents that revealed the full scope of their relationship and their future plans. Most damaging were the screenshots of their private message exchanges where they discussed their post-reunion plans. Will had told Claudia that after the family gathering, he would finally be free to start our real life together. They'd been apartment hunting in Charleston, planning elaborate vacations and discussing wedding arrangements, all funded by money stolen from his employer and hidden from me. My corporate investigation background had taught me to follow vendor relationships when tracking financial fraud. I began systematically contacting the restaurants, hotels, and service providers that appeared on Will's expense reports, verifying which transactions were legitimate business expenses and which were personal expenditures fraudulently categorized. The pattern that emerged was more extensive than I'd anticipated. Will had developed relationships with multiple vendors who were willing to participate in his fraud scheme. Restaurant managers would inflate bills in exchange for guaranteed business. Hotel clerks would upgrade rooms while charging corporate rates. Even some conference organizers were providing fake registration confirmations for events that Will never attended. This network of corruption extended beyond simple financial fraud. It represented a comprehensive conspiracy that involved multiple businesses and individuals. Each vendor relationship I documented added another layer of criminal activity to Will's growing legal exposure. By mid-August, 1 week before the family reunion, I had assembled what any prosecutor would consider an airtight case against Will Bennett. The evidence file contained over 300 pages of financial documents, 150 screenshots of social media communications, GPS location data for more than 50 fraudulent business trips, and video evidence of Will meeting with Claudia at locations that contradicted his reported work schedule. But beyond the sheer volume of evidence was its quality. Every piece of documentation met legal standards for admissibility. Every financial transaction had been verified through multiple sources. Every digital record included metadata that confirmed its authenticity. I hadn't just gathered evidence, I'd built a case that could withstand the most aggressive legal challenge. The psychological profile that emerged from this investigation revealed Will to be far more calculating than I'd ever imagined. His betrayal wasn't the result of impulsive attraction or momentary weakness. It was the product of years of deliberate planning and systematic deception. As the family reunion approached, I made my final preparations for what would become the most important presentation of my professional career. I organized the evidence into compelling visual narratives that would be impossible to dismiss or rationalize. Every financial transaction was color-coded and mapped to corresponding social media activity. Every lie Will had told was documented alongside photographic proof of his real activities. I prepared multiple presentation formats, a comprehensive digital slideshow for detailed review, printed summaries for distribution, and a streamlined version optimized for mobile devices. I wanted to ensure that regardless of the technology available at the reunion, I could present irrefutable evidence of Will's deception. Most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for what was coming. The evidence I'd gathered would destroy not just Will's marriage, but his relationships with his family, his professional reputation, and his freedom. The man who'd spent 6 years lying to me was about to face the consequences of his choices in the most public and devastating way possible. But as I reviewed the comprehensive documentation of his betrayal one final time, I felt no guilt about what I was planning to do. Will had made his choices deliberately and systematically over many years. The family reunion would simply be the moment when those choices finally caught up with him. The perfect crime was about to meet perfect justice, and I had the evidence to prove it. The week before the reunion brought an unexpected twist that made Will's deception even more grotesque. As I maintained my performance as the understanding wife, I found myself receiving praise from the Bennett family for exactly the qualities that were enabling Will's betrayal. During my solo dinner with Anthony and Julie Sr., they'd spent considerable time complimenting my patience with Will's demanding work schedule. "You're such a supportive wife," Julie Sr. had said. "Not every woman would be so understanding about all these business emergencies." Anthony nodded approvingly. "Will is lucky to have someone who appreciates the sacrifices necessary for professional success." I sat there accepting their praise while knowing that Will's career demands were actually romantic getaways with his mistress, funded by embezzled money. The Bennett family was literally celebrating my role in facilitating their son's criminal activities. Even more disturbing was learning how Will's employer had unknowingly enabled his fraud. During my investigation, I discovered that MedCore Solutions' expense reporting system had significant security flaws that Will had been exploiting systematically. Expenses under $500 were automatically approved without human review. Receipts weren't required until quarterly audits. The system allowed employees to submit client entertainment expenses without requiring details about which clients were involved. Will had essentially discovered that his company was paying him to steal from them. His supervisor regularly complimented him on his dedication to client relationships, not realizing that his client entertainment expenses were funding an elaborate affair. The ultimate irony came when I discovered that Will had been named salesperson of the quarter for the same period when his fraudulent expenses peaked. The company had rewarded him for the quarter when he stole the most money from them. Claudia's social media presence revealed another layer of irony that made their deception even more infuriating. She regularly posted inspirational quotes about honesty, integrity, and living authentically. Her LinkedIn profile described her as someone who values transparency and ethical business practices. While publicly advocating for moral behavior, she was privately helping Will steal money from their employer and destroy his marriage. Her Instagram was filled with photos from their stolen getaways, tagged with captions like "grateful for honest connections" and "living my truth." The most galling discovery was a post she'd made about supporting women in business just days after I'd learned about their affair. She'd shared an article about women helping other women succeed professionally, while actively participating in the destruction of another woman's marriage and financial security. As the reunion approached, I discovered that Will's deception had financial implications for his extended family that none of them realized. Uncle Dexter had invested in a business venture based on Will's recommendation, not knowing that Will's financial advice was based on information stolen from his employer. The Bennett family's financial interconnectedness meant that Will's crimes had touched almost everyone who would be at the reunion. They'd all benefited directly or indirectly from his stolen money while believing they were dealing with a successful, ethical family member. Most troubling was discovering that Will had been using his family connections to further his fraud scheme. He'd submitted expense reports for family obligations that were actually romantic dinners with Claudia. The ultimate irony emerged in the final days before the reunion. Will's plan to escape depended entirely on maintaining the very relationships he was betraying. His exit strategy required his family's continued trust, his employer's continued confidence, and my continued naivety. But his overconfidence in manipulating these relationships had created the exact conditions for his downfall. The man who thought he was too smart to get caught had been living with a forensic investigator for 6 years. Will Bennett was about to learn that irony, when it finally arrives, doesn't just wound, it destroys completely. With the family reunion just 5 days away, I began orchestrating the perfect moment for Will's exposure. My professional experience had taught me that timing wasn't just important in investigations, it was everything. Reveal evidence too early, and the target has time to prepare damage control. Wait too long, and you lose the element of surprise. The Bennett family reunion followed a predictable schedule that I'd observed for 6 years. The Sunday afternoon family meeting was my target. By then, everyone would be present, relaxed, and emotionally invested in the weekend. The formal setting would ensure serious attention, while the family context would maximize emotional impact on Will. But the timing had to be precise. Too early in the meeting, and other business might overshadow my revelation. Too late, and people might start leaving. I needed to position my announcement at the exact moment when it would have maximum impact and minimum opportunity for Will to recover. Presenting complex evidence to 75 people at an outdoor family gathering required careful logistical planning. I couldn't rely on sophisticated audio equipment. Everything had to be visible, audible, and comprehensible without technological assistance. I created poster board presentations that could be easily displayed and passed around. Each board focused on a specific aspect of Will's deception: financial fraud timeline, affair documentation, vendor conspiracy network, and escape plan evidence. For digital evidence, I prepared multiple tablets and smartphones preloaded with the most damaging photos, messages, and financial records. These devices would be passed through the crowd, allowing everyone to see evidence firsthand rather than relying on my descriptions. Most importantly, I prepared comprehensive evidence packets for every adult family member. Each packet contained essential financial documents, photographs, and timeline information proving Will's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. My investigation background had taught me that evidence alone doesn't determine outcomes, human psychology does. Will's family loved him, trusted him, and had built their identity around his success. Convincing them to accept the truth would require more than just showing documents. I prepared for every psychological defense mechanism the family might employ. Denial would be first. I organized evidence to progress from undeniable to shocking, making denial increasingly difficult. Anger would follow, but I needed it directed at Will rather than at me. Bargaining would be third. I prepared responses explaining why private solutions were impossible given the legal implications. Understanding the Bennett family power structure was crucial. Anthony would need concrete proof before believing accusations against his favored son. Julie Sr. would focus on emotional betrayal. Spencer would be inclined to believe negative information about Will. Uncle Dexter's business background would make him sensitive to financial fraud. Professional investigators always prepare for unexpected developments. What if Will didn't attend the family meeting? What if he tried to leave early? What if he attempted to discredit my evidence or attack my credibility? I prepared contingency plans for each scenario. If Will tried to leave, I'd present evidence before he could escape. If he questioned my evidence, I'd invite him to explain financial transactions and GPS data that contradicted his alibis. If he tried to turn the family against me, I'd remind them that evidence spoke for itself regardless of their feelings about my methods. Most importantly, I prepared for the possibility that Will might claim our marriage had problems justifying his behavior. I documented his public statements about our relationship, making it impossible for him to rewrite history. Preparing to destroy someone's life in front of their entire family required building emotional defenses that would allow me to function effectively during the confrontation. I spent hours rehearsing my presentation, ensuring I could deliver information clearly and calmly regardless of the emotional chaos that would follow. I practiced responses to accusations and attacks that would likely come my way. Will would probably claim I was vindictive, unstable, or motivated by jealousy rather than justice. His family might initially blame me for exposing truth rather than protecting Will from consequences, but I'd also prepared reminders about why this confrontation was necessary. Will's crimes weren't victimless. His employer had lost money, his family had been deceived, and I'd been systematically betrayed and financially exploited. The reunion revelation wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Will Bennett had spent years underestimating the woman he'd married. He was about to discover exactly how costly that mistake would be. 2 days before the reunion, I entered a state of hyper-focused preparation. Every detail mattered now. I moved through our house like a forensic technician preparing for the most important case of my career, which in many ways it was. I spent Thursday evening creating backup copies of all evidence files, storing them on multiple encrypted drives distributed between my car, office, and a safety deposit box. If Will discovered my investigation and tried to destroy evidence, I wanted multiple copies to survive any damage control attempt. The physical evidence packets required careful assembly. Each folder contained 47 pages of documentation, organized chronologically, with clear summaries explaining each piece's significance. I created color-coded tabs allowing family members to quickly locate financial fraud, affair documentation, escape planning, and vendor conspiracy evidence. Friday morning, I began technical preparations, ensuring flawless evidence presentation. I loaded digital evidence onto 6 different tablets and smartphones, organizing content for optimal impact. The devices were synchronized to display the same information simultaneously, allowing multiple family members to review evidence at once. I created a master presentation timeline, correlating financial transactions with social media posts, GPS locations, and photographic evidence. The timeline would be projected onto Uncle Dexter's large screen, but I prepared standalone versions that could function without technological support. Most critically, I tested every device to ensure battery life would last through the entire confrontation. I had backup charging equipment, printed screenshots of digital evidence, and alternative presentation methods, ready if any technology failed. Friday afternoon, I conducted my dress rehearsal, practicing my presentation with the precision I'd apply to corporate litigation briefing. Every word was chosen for maximum clarity and impact. Every pause was calculated to allow emotional reactions to process before continuing. I rehearsed responses to specific objections from each family member. Anthony would demand concrete proof. I prepared bank statements and expense reports. Julie Sr. would focus on emotional betrayal. I organized the most devastating social media conversations. Spencer would want to understand financial damage scope. I calculated exact dollar amounts for each fraud category. The most important rehearsal involved preparing for Will's likely counterattacks. He would probably claim I'd invaded privacy, misinterpreted innocent communications, or acted vindictively. I practiced responses redirecting attention to evidence itself rather than my gathering methods. Friday evening, I met with Marcus Riley one final time to ensure my evidence presentation wouldn't compromise future legal proceedings. We reviewed each document, confirming everything had been obtained legally and could be used in court if necessary. Marcus provided contact information for federal investigators specializing in corporate fraud cases. If this family meeting doesn't result in Will facing appropriate consequences, he told me, you'll need to involve law enforcement. The scope of his crimes requires federal intervention. I also finalized arrangements with a divorce attorney, specializing in cases involving financial fraud. Preliminary paperwork was prepared, requiring only my signature to initiate proceedings. I wanted to ensure Will couldn't use post-exposure chaos to hide additional assets or create new financial obligations in my name. Saturday morning, I focused on personal preparations, allowing me to maintain composure during what would be the most emotionally challenging day of my life. I packed carefully, choosing clothing projecting competence and seriousness rather than fashion or comfort. I brought an overnight bag containing everything needed if I couldn't return home after the confrontation. Will's reaction to exposure might make it unsafe or inadvisable to continue living in our house. I'd arranged to stay with my sister if necessary, avoiding having to return for essential items. Most importantly, I spent time mentally preparing for the emotional aftermath of destroying Will's life in front of his entire family. While I felt completely justified in exposing his crimes, I understood the confrontation would be traumatic for everyone involved, including myself. As we pulled into the gravel driveway, and I saw the Bennett family gathered on the front porch, welcoming us with genuine warmth and affection, I experienced one last moment of doubt. These people loved Will, they'd built their family identity around pride in his character and achievements. But as I looked at the evidence folder in my lap, I reminded myself that Will had made the choices creating this situation. I was simply revealing truth about decisions he'd made systematically over many years. The Bennett family deserved to know who Will really was, and I deserved to stop living a lie that had consumed 6 years of my life. The Bennett family property looked exactly as it had for the past 6 reunions, sprawling green lawns dotted with white canvas tents, picnic tables arranged in conversational clusters, and the smell of charcoal grills preparing for evening barbecue. What was different this year was my perspective. Instead of seeing a welcoming family gathering, I saw a stage where Will's carefully constructed life was about to collapse. As we pulled up the gravel driveway, family members emerged from the main house and various tent setups to greet us. Grandma Bennett, now 86, but still sharp, was among the first to reach our car. She embraced Will with special affection reserved for her favorite grandson. "There's my successful boy," she said, patting his cheek. "I've been bragging to everyone at the senior center about how well you're doing at that pharmaceutical company." The irony was profound. Grandma Bennett was proud of success, built entirely on theft and fraud. Her bragging rights were based on criminal activity she couldn't imagine her beloved grandson engaging in. Over the next few hours, I observed Bennett family dynamics with the analytical eye of someone who knew these relationships were about to be permanently altered. Anthony and Julie Sr. held court near the main barbecue area, serving as the gravitational center around which the extended family orbited. Spencer had arrived from Denver with his latest girlfriend, Rebecca, who seemed overwhelmed by the Bennett family network's size and intensity. Julie Jr. was managing her twin boys while trying to participate in adult conversations, a balancing act requiring constant vigilance. I paid particular attention to Uncle Dexter's stories about a real estate investment Will had recommended. According to Dexter, Will's insider knowledge of pharmaceutical company expansion plans had helped him identify a promising commercial property opportunity. What Dexter didn't know was that Will's insider knowledge came from stolen corporate documents. Throughout Saturday afternoon and evening, I watched Will maintain his performance as the perfect family member with remarkable consistency. He helped elderly relatives with chairs, organized a touch football game for younger cousins, and volunteered to drive to town when someone realized they'd forgotten ice. Every gesture reinforced the family's perception of Will as responsible, caring, and dependable. He was building social capital with every act of kindness, making it even more shocking when that capital would be completely destroyed by revelation of his true character. The most painful moments came when family members praised Will's character in my presence. "You're so lucky to be married to such a good man," Aunt Patricia told me, while we arranged dessert tables. "Will is exactly the kind of husband every woman hopes to find." The traditional Saturday evening barbecue was a sprawling affair involving 73 family members, from Grandma Bennett's elderly sister to 3-year-old cousin Emma, experiencing her first family reunion. The gathering represented 4 generations of Bennett family history, all united by blood, marriage, and shared values. As I watched families share food and stories around picnic tables, I was struck by how Will's deception had contaminated even these innocent moments. His theft had funded family gifts that were now part of Bennett family lore. His fraudulent business advice had influenced financial decisions affecting multiple households. During dinner, Anthony stood to offer the traditional family toast. "To the Bennett family," he said, raising his beer bottle, "for staying true to the values that built this family. Hard work, honesty, and loyalty to each other." The irony was overwhelming. The family was toasting the exact values that Will had systematically violated for years. They were celebrating principles that their golden boy had completely abandoned in pursuit of money and sexual gratification. After dinner, the family settled into traditional evening socializing. The older generation gathered around the main fire pit to share family stories. The middle generation clustered around picnic tables, discussing children, careers, and home renovations. The younger cousins organized games that would continue until parents called bedtime. I found myself moving between groups, listening to conversations with new ears. So many topics touched on Will, his professional success, stable marriage, financial acumen, reliability as a family member. The Bennett family identity was deeply intertwined with Will's reputation, making the coming revelation even more devastating. During one particularly painful conversation, Spencer mentioned thinking about leaving his renewable energy job to pursue pharmaceutical sales like Will. "He's proven it's possible to build a really successful career in that industry," Spencer said. "Maybe he could give me advice about making the transition." As the evening wound down and families began retreating to assigned sleeping arrangements, I experienced a surreal sense of calm. The evidence was prepared, timing was set, and the stage was arranged exactly as I needed it. Tomorrow's family meeting would begin at 2 p.m., giving everyone time to recover while ensuring maximum attendance. Will was in an expansive mood, clearly enjoying his role as the family success story. He spent extra time talking with his grandmother, helped Uncle Dexter troubleshoot equipment problems, and made plans with Spencer for early morning fishing. He was savoring what he didn't know would be his last hours, as the Bennett family's golden boy. "Yes," I said that night, "tomorrow is going to be very revealing about what really matters." Sunday morning dawned with perfect August weather that made the Bennett family reunion feel like a Norman Rockwell painting. The air was crisp, the sky cloudless, and the smell of Julie Sr.'s famous pancake breakfast drifted across the property. I woke early, my internal clock disrupted by anticipation, and lay listening to Will sleep peacefully beside me. The irony wasn't lost on me that this would be the last morning we'd ever wake up together. In a few hours, our marriage would be effectively over, destroyed not by my revelation, but by the systematic betrayal I was about to expose. Will had ended our relationship months ago, with his first fraudulent expense report, and his first lie about Claudia. As families emerged from various sleeping arrangements and gathered for breakfast, I observed the Bennett morning routine with detached fascination. Will threw himself into morning activities with the enthusiasm of someone trying to create perfect final memories, organizing games and volunteering to help with setup. Will's behavior throughout the morning suggested he was preparing for departure in ways no one else recognized. During breakfast, he made unusually sentimental comments about family traditions and childhood memories. He spent extra time talking with Grandma Bennett, asking detailed questions about family history that seemed academic rather than conversational. Most tellingly, he made several comments about appreciating the present moment and not taking family for granted. "You never know when circumstances might change," he told Uncle Dexter during a conversation about the next reunion's location. It's important to treasure these times together. I watched his performance with growing fascination. Will was saying goodbye without anyone realizing it. He was creating closure for himself, while maintaining the illusion that he'd be part of future family gatherings. The psychological complexity of his deception was remarkable in its calculation. As lunch concluded and family members began preparing for the afternoon meeting, I started my own subtle positioning strategy. I made sure my evidence materials were easily accessible, but not visible to casual observation. I confirmed technological equipment was functioning properly, and positioned where I could access it quickly. Most importantly, I began observing family dynamics that would determine how my revelation was received. Anthony was in an expansive mood, pleased with the weekend's success. Julie Sr. was coordinating meeting logistics with her usual efficiency. Spencer and Julie Jr. were positioning themselves near the back of the seating area, their usual spots for family meetings. While other family members relaxed between lunch and the meeting, I conducted final technical preparations under the guise of helping with setup. I tested the microphone system that would amplify my presentation, confirmed the projection screen could display my evidence clearly, and verified backup devices were functioning properly. The most crucial element was ensuring my evidence packets were distributed efficiently when the moment came. I'd arranged 73 identical folders in a carrying case that looked like standard meeting materials. Each folder was labeled with a family member's name, and contained customized evidence presentations. Anthony called the meeting to order with traditional opening remarks about family unity and shared values. He reviewed the weekend's activities, thanked various family members who'd contributed to the reunion's success, and outlined the agenda for afternoon discussion. As the meeting progressed through routine business, I observed family dynamics that would soon be permanently altered. These people trusted each other completely. They operated on the assumption that family members were honest, ethical, and worthy of unconditional support. That assumption was about to be shattered. As various family members shared updates about their lives and achievements, Will's name came up repeatedly in contexts that made my stomach turn. Cousin Marcus thanked Will for business advice that had helped him expand his construction company. Aunt Patricia mentioned how proud she was of Will's professional success and moral character. Most painfully, Grandma Bennett spoke about how Will represented everything she'd hoped the Bennett family would become: successful, ethical, and devoted to family values. She was literally praising him for qualities that were the exact opposite of his true character. Each compliment, each expression of pride, each statement of trust was another layer of upcoming devastation. The family wasn't just going to learn that Will was a criminal and an adulterer. They were going to realize that their pride in him had been completely misplaced. As the meeting moved toward its conclusion, Anthony asked if anyone had additional announcements or concerns to share with the family. This was my moment, the opening I'd been waiting for. I stood up slowly, my evidence folder in hand, and asked for everyone's attention. "I have something important to share with the family," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the gathering. "It concerns Will, and I think everyone needs to know what I've discovered." The room fell silent. 73 pairs of eyes turned toward me, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. Will looked confused but not yet alarmed. He still had no idea what was coming. I took a deep breath and began the presentation that would destroy his life. What happened next was so perfectly orchestrated by fate that I couldn't have planned it better myself. As I stood before the assembled Bennett family, preparing to begin my presentation, Will's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. He glanced at it casually, then his expression changed completely. I watched his face cycle through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, concern, calculation, and finally, decision. He stood up abruptly, interrupting the expectant silence that had fallen over the family gathering. "I'm really sorry, everyone," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced regret of someone who'd delivered similar speeches many times before. "I just got an urgent message from work. There's a crisis with one of our biggest accounts, and I need to drive back to Atlanta immediately to handle it." The family murmured with disappointment and concern. This was exactly the kind of emergency that had defined Will's reputation as a dedicated professional, always putting his responsibilities first, always available when his company needed him most. "Can't it wait until tomorrow?" Anthony asked. "The reunion doesn't officially end until evening." Will shook his head with apparent frustration. "I wish it could, Dad, but the client is threatening to cancel a $4.2 million contract if we don't have someone there tonight to address their concerns. Claudia is already on her way to the meeting location, and they specifically requested that both of us be present." What came next was a moment of such calculated cruelty that it took my breath away. Will turned to me with an expression of apologetic helplessness that would have been convincing if I hadn't known the truth. "Penelope, honey, I know this is terrible timing, but I need to leave right now. The thing is, I drove straight from the office Friday evening to pick up Claudia for this emergency trip, and I need to take her back to Atlanta for the client meeting. There's not really room for 3 people in my car with all the presentation materials we need to bring." The family was listening intently, accepting this explanation as another example of Will's professional dedication. But I understood what was really happening. Will was abandoning me at his family reunion to run off with his mistress, and he was doing it in front of 73 witnesses who would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. "Can't someone else give Penelope a ride home?" Julie Sr. asked, immediately moving into problem-solving mode. "Of course we can work something out," Will replied smoothly. "Spencer, would you mind giving Penelope a ride back to Atlanta tomorrow? I'll make sure to compensate you for the gas and inconvenience." Spencer nodded immediately. "No problem at all. I was planning to drive back tomorrow afternoon anyway." What made the moment even more devastating was watching the family rally around Will's decision with understanding and support. Uncle Dexter patted his shoulder sympathetically. "That's the price of success, son. The more valuable you become to your company, the more they depend on you for crucial situations." Grandma Bennett looked disappointed but proud. "I hate that you have to miss the rest of the reunion, but I understand that sometimes work has to come first. That's what makes you such a good provider." Aunt Patricia was already organizing logistics. "Don't worry about Penelope, we'll take good care of her. Maybe this will give us a chance to hear some stories about married life that you usually don't let her tell." The family's complete acceptance of Will's excuse made their upcoming shock even more profound. They were enabling his abandonment of me while believing they were supporting his professional integrity. As Will began making his rounds to say goodbye to various family members, expressing regret about missing the rest of the reunion, I realized that this was the perfect moment to reveal the truth. The family was gathered, engaged, and emotionally invested in Will's story. His abandonment had created exactly the dramatic tension I needed for maximum impact. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the gathering, "before Will leaves, I think there's something the family needs to know about these work emergencies." Will turned toward me with a slightly puzzled expression, still confident that his cover story was secure. "What do you mean, honey?" I smiled at him with the same warmth I'd shown throughout our marriage, then pulled out my phone and began scrolling through the evidence I'd prepared. "Well, since you mentioned Claudia, I thought the family might be interested in seeing some photos from your recent business trips together." The shift in Will's expression was immediate and dramatic. The confident smile vanished, replaced by a look of dawning horror as he realized that his carefully constructed life was about to collapse. I held up my phone so the family could see the screen, displaying a photograph of Will and Claudia sharing an intimate dinner at a romantic restaurant. The image was perfectly clear, showing them holding hands across a candlelit table, their body language unmistakably romantic rather than professional. This was taken during Will's supposed business conference in Nashville 3 months ago. I explained calmly. The metadata shows it was captured at La Bella Vita, a romantic Italian restaurant in Asheville, North Carolina, approximately 200 miles from where Will claimed to be attending mandatory training seminars. The family's reaction was immediate but confused. Several people leaned forward to get a better look at the image, while others turned to Will for explanation. "Now I'm sure there's a perfectly innocent explanation," I continued. swiping to the next photo. Perhaps this image of them kissing on a hotel balcony was also part of their professional relationship. The second photograph left no room for innocent interpretation. Will and Claudia were clearly engaged in a passionate embrace against the backdrop of a luxury resort, their romantic involvement undeniable. Will stood frozen in the center of the family gathering, his escape route suddenly blocked by the revelation of his deception. The car he'd planned to use for his romantic getaway with Claudia was still in the driveway, but leaving now would only confirm the accusations I was making. "Penelope, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice strained with panic. "You're taking these photos completely out of context." "Am I?" I replied, continuing to scroll through my evidence. "Let me show everyone the context." I displayed a screenshot of Will's expense report from the Nashville trip, showing reimbursement claims for conference registration, hotel accommodation, and meal expenses. Then I showed the family the actual receipts I'd discovered: romantic dinners for 2 luxury hotel suites and spa treatments that had nothing to do with pharmaceutical training. The Bennett family was beginning to understand that what they were witnessing wasn't a misunderstanding or a marital dispute. It was the exposure of systematic deception that had touched every aspect of Will's life. Uncle Dexter, with his business background, was the first to grasp the implications. "Will, are you submitting false expense reports to your company?" "It's not what it looks like," Will protested, but his voice lacked conviction. He was overwhelmed by the sudden exposure and struggling to construct a defense. "Then what is it?" Anthony demanded, his paternal authority evident in his tone. "Explain to us what we're looking at, because it certainly looks like evidence of fraud and adultery." I could see Will calculating his options, trying to determine whether he could salvage the situation through charm, manipulation, or outright denial. But the evidence was too comprehensive, and the family's trust was too shattered for any of his usual tactics to work. As Will stood in the center of his family's shocked attention, desperately searching for words that could explain away months of documented deception, his phone buzzed again with another text message. This time, everyone in the family could see the preview on his screen. "Where are you?" "I'm waiting at the hotel. Can't wait to finally be free to start our real life together." The message was from Claudia, and it contained exactly the kind of language that made their relationship's true nature undeniable. The family read it in stunned silence, the final piece of evidence falling into place. Will's carefully planned escape had become his moment of maximum vulnerability. His attempt to abandon me at the family reunion had instead created the perfect opportunity for his complete exposure. The golden boy of the Bennett family was about to fall from grace in the most public and devastating way possible, and I was just getting started. With Claudia's text message still glowing on Will's phone screen for the entire family to see, I knew this was the moment to unleash the full scope of my investigation. The groundwork had been laid perfectly. Will's attempt to abandon me for a work emergency had been exposed as a lie, and the family was primed to receive shocking information. "Since we're all here together," I announced, reaching for my prepared evidence materials, "I think this is the perfect time to share what I've learned about Will's business activities over the past few months." I activated the projection system that Uncle Dexter had set up for the family slideshow, and the first image appeared on the large screen for everyone to see clearly. It was a comprehensive timeline showing Will's claimed business trips versus his actual locations, with GPS data and photographic evidence documenting each deception. "This timeline covers the past 8 months," I explained, my voice steady and professional. "The blue entries show where Will claimed to be for work purposes. The red entries show where he actually was, based on credit card transactions, GPS data from his phone, and photographic evidence from social media." The family stared at the screen in stunned silence as the scope of Will's deception became clear. Every supposed business trip had been a lie, every emergency meeting had been a romantic getaway, every professional conference had been a cover for his affair. "But that's just the beginning," I continued, advancing to the next slide. What I discovered next was even more shocking. The screen now displayed a comprehensive breakdown of Will's expense reports, color-coded to show legitimate business expenses versus fraudulent claims. The fraudulent expenses were highlighted in red, and they dominated the presentation. Over the past 5 years, Will has submitted $127,000 in fraudulent expense reports to his employer, I announced. He's been stealing money from Medcore Solutions to fund his personal activities, including his relationship with Claudia. Uncle Dexter leaned forward in his chair, his business experience helping him understand the implications immediately. Will, is this true? Have you been embezzling money from your company? Will opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. He was overwhelmed by the comprehensive nature of the evidence and the realization that his entire web of lies was unraveling simultaneously. I advanced to the next section of my presentation, revealing the network of vendors who had been complicit in Will's fraud scheme. The embezzlement wasn't just simple expense manipulation, I explained. Will had developed relationships with restaurant managers, hotel clerks, and conference organizers who provided inflated receipts and fake documentation in exchange for guaranteed business. The screen showed a network diagram connecting Will to various businesses, with dollar amounts indicating how much each vendor had helped him steal. The complexity and sophistication of the fraud scheme shocked the family into deeper silence. For example, I continued, pointing to specific entries, Rossetti's restaurant would charge Will $200 for a dinner, but provide a receipt for $500, with Will pocketing the difference in cash. The Grand View Hotel would upgrade his rooms for free while charging his company premium rates. These weren't isolated incidents, they were systematic partnerships designed to facilitate theft. Anthony's voice was barely above a whisper when he asked, "How long has this been going on?" 5 years, I replied, starting approximately 6 months after our wedding. I moved to the most emotionally devastating section of my presentation, how Will's crimes had affected his own family members. The screen displayed a series of transactions showing money that Will had borrowed or received from family members, contrasted with his theft from his employer. Uncle Dexter, I said, addressing him directly, you invested $15,000 in a commercial property based on Will's recommendation. Will told you he had insider knowledge about pharmaceutical company expansion plans. That information came from stolen corporate documents. Dexter's face went white as he realized the implications. Cousin Marcus, I continued, you borrowed $8,000 from Will for your daughter's college tuition. That money came directly from fraudulent expense reimbursements. The personal connections made the crimes feel more immediate and visceral for the family. Will hadn't just stolen from a faceless corporation, he'd used stolen money to manipulate his own relatives. The final section of my presentation revealed the most devastating truth of all, Will's comprehensive plan to abandon his family forever. The screen displayed apartment lease agreements, travel reservations, and financial transfers that documented his intention to disappear. Will has been planning to leave his job, liquidate his assets, and move to Charleston with Claudia, I announced. The apartment lease begins tomorrow. The financial transfers were scheduled to complete on Monday. This family reunion was intended to be his final goodbye, though none of you were supposed to know it. Julie Sr. gasped audibly, "You were going to leave without telling us?" I displayed the final piece of evidence, a series of text messages between Will and Claudia, discussing their freedom and their plans for a new life together, without the complications of Will's family obligations. With all the evidence displayed and explained, I turned to face Will directly. "So when you say you need to leave for a work emergency," I said, my voice carrying across the silent gathering, "what you really mean is that you're abandoning me at your family reunion to run away with your mistress, using money you've stolen from your employer to start a new life in another state." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Every family member was staring at Will, waiting for him to deny the accusations, to provide some explanation that would make sense of what they'd just learned. But Will said nothing. He stood in the center of the gathering, his shoulders slumped, his carefully maintained facade completely destroyed. The golden boy of the Bennett family had been revealed as a criminal, an adulterer, and a man planning to abandon everyone who loved him. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds. Then the dam broke, and the family erupted in a chaos of shocked voices, angry questions, and emotional outbursts. "How could you do this to Penelope?" Julie Jr. demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "How could you do this to us?" Anthony added, his paternal authority transformed into profound disappointment. Spencer was staring at his brother with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Will, what the hell were you thinking?" Grandma Bennett, the the family matriarch, whose approval Will had always cherished, looked as if she'd been physically struck. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "This isn't the grandson I raised." Finally Will found his voice, but his words only made the situation worse. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "It's complicated. The marriage, things haven't been right between Penelope and me for a long time, and the company money, I was going to pay it back." His explanations sounded pathetic even to him. The evidence was too comprehensive, the planning too elaborate, the deception too systematic for any of his usual charm to work. "Pay it back with what money?" Uncle Dexter demanded. "You just showed us you were planning to disappear to another state. And what about our family?" Julie Sr. asked, tears streaming down her face. "Were you really going to vanish without saying goodbye?" Without explaining anything, Will had no answer for these questions, because there was no answer that could justify what he'd done. He'd been caught completely, and everyone in his family now understood exactly who he really was. The golden boy had fallen, and there was no way back up. As Will stood speechless in the center of the family gathering, I reached for the evidence packets I'd prepared for this exact moment. The shock and disbelief on the family's faces told me that they needed more than just my word and a few photographs. They needed comprehensive, undeniable proof that couldn't be dismissed or rationalized. "I know this is overwhelming," I said, addressing the family while maintaining eye contact with Will. "And I know that some of you might be thinking there has to be some mistake, some innocent explanation for what you're seeing. So I've prepared detailed documentation for everyone." I began distributing the personalized evidence folders I'd assembled, each one containing 73 pages of financial records, photographic evidence, and timeline documentation. The family members opened their folders with the kind of nervous anticipation usually reserved for medical test results. "What you're looking at is 5 years of systematic fraud, embezzlement, and deception," I explained. "Every document has been verified. Every photograph contains metadata proving when and where it was taken. Every financial transaction has been cross-referenced with multiple sources." Uncle Dexter, with his business background, was the first to understand the significance of what he was reviewing. "These GPS coordinates," he said, looking up from his folder with a stunned expression. "They show exact locations for every photo, every transaction, every claimed business trip." "That's correct," I confirmed. "Modern digital evidence doesn't lie." When Will claimed to be at a pharmaceutical conference in Tampa, the GPS data from his credit card transactions shows he was actually at a romantic resort in the Bahamas with Claudia. I activated my laptop and projected a map showing Will's actual movements overlaid with his claimed business locations. The visual representation made the scope of his deception impossible to deny. Red dots showed where he'd actually been, while blue dots showed where he'd told me, his family, and his employer he was located. "Every red dot represents a lie," I said simply. "Every blue dot represents where Will claimed to be. As you can see, they almost never match." Anthony, as the family patriarch, had turned to the financial documentation with the kind of focused attention he'd once applied to his insurance business. "Penelope," said, his voice carefully controlled, "these expense reports, they show Will claiming reimbursement for the same trips where he was actually with this woman." "Yes," I replied. "Will has been using his company's expense account to fund his affair. Every romantic dinner, every luxury hotel, every weekend getaway was paid for by MedCore Solutions through fraudulent expense claims." I displayed a detailed breakdown, showing how Will had categorized his romantic expenses as legitimate business costs. Couples massage treatments were listed as client entertainment, champagne dinners were classified as prospect development, luxury suite upgrades were filed as conference accommodation. "The total amount stolen is $127,000 over 5 years, I announced. "But that's just what I could document. The actual figure is likely much higher." Julie Sr. was studying a section of her evidence packet that documented Will's relationships with various vendors. "These restaurants and hotels," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "they were helping him steal money." Will had developed a network of businesses that would provide inflated receipts in exchange for guaranteed repeat business, I explained. For example, Marcello's restaurant would charge Will $150 for dinner, but provide a receipt for $400. Will would submit the $400 receipt to his company for reimbursement, keep the extra $250 in cash, and use that money for additional personal expenses. I showed the family a chart detailing each vendor relationship, complete with documentation of the inflated billing schemes. The sophistication of Will's fraud network shocked even Uncle Dexter, who dealt with financial crimes in his business career. "This isn't opportunistic theft," Dexter said grimly. "This is organized criminal activity." Spencer was reviewing a section that showed how Will's crimes had directly affected his own relatives. "Wait," he said, looking up with a confused expression. "This shows that I received a loan from Will last year, but according to this, that money came from stolen funds. When you borrowed $3,000 from Will to help with your moving expenses, I confirmed that money had been embezzled from his employer 2 weeks earlier through fake conference registration fees." The realization that they'd unknowingly benefited from Will's crimes hit several family members simultaneously. Cousin Marcus discovered that his business loan had been funded by theft. Aunt Patricia learned that the expensive anniversary gift Will had given her was purchased with stolen money. "We're all victims of his deception," I said gently. "Will used stolen money to maintain his reputation as a generous, successful family member. Every act of seeming kindness was actually funded by criminal activity." I displayed a series of text message screenshots that revealed the callous way Will and Claudia had discussed his family. The messages showed them laughing about family gatherings, making jokes about fooling the relatives, and planning ways to extract maximum financial benefit from family relationships before disappearing. One particularly devastating message from Will to Claudia read, "They have no idea what's coming. By Monday, I'll be free of all these family obligations forever. Just need to get through one more fake reunion performance." Julie Jr. was crying as she read the messages. "You were laughing at us," she said to Will. "All those times we worried about you working too hard, all those dinners where we praised your success, you were laughing at us." The final section of evidence documented Will's comprehensive plan to abandon his family and start a new life with Claudia. Apartment lease agreements, utility connection requests, bank account transfers, and travel reservations painted a picture of meticulous planning. "Will was scheduled to give notice at his job tomorrow," I announced. The apartment in Charleston was ready for occupancy. The financial transfers would have moved the remaining stolen funds to accounts that only he and Claudia could access. Anthony was staring at documentation showing that Will had already established residency in South Carolina, complete with voter registration and driver's license address changes. "You were really going to disappear without telling us?" As the family absorbed the comprehensive evidence of Will's betrayal, I played the final piece of proof, an audio recording of Will discussing his escape plans with Claudia during one of their hotel meetings. His voice was clearly audible as he described his strategy for cutting ties with the family drama and starting fresh where no one knows our history. The recording included Will's assessment of each family member's likely reaction to his disappearance, his plans for avoiding legal consequences, and his excitement about finally being free of his family responsibilities. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute. Every family member had heard Will in his own voice, describing them as obstacles to his happiness and burdens to be discarded. Will had listened to the comprehensive presentation of evidence, with the expression of someone watching his own execution. Every document, every photograph, every financial record was authentic and verifiable. There was no room for denial, no possibility of explanation, no hope of redemption. "Will," Anthony said quietly, "is any of this untrue? Is there any part of this evidence that's been fabricated or misrepresented?" Will looked around the circle of faces, his parents, siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, all waiting for him to deny the accusations, to provide some explanation that would restore their faith in him. But there was no explanation that could overcome the comprehensive documentation of his crimes and betrayals. The golden boy of the Bennett family had been exposed completely, and everyone now understood exactly who he really was. "No," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "It's all true." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence, final and irreversible. With Claudia's text message still glowing on Will's phone screen for the entire family to see, I knew this was the moment to unleash the full scope of my investigation. The groundwork had been laid perfectly. Will's attempt to abandon me for a work emergency had been exposed as a lie, and the family was primed to receive shocking information. Since we're all here together, I announced, reaching for my prepared evidence materials, I think this is the perfect time to share what I've learned about Will's business activities over the past few months. I activated the projection system that Uncle Dexter had set up for the family slideshow, and the first image appeared on the large screen for everyone to see clearly. It was a comprehensive timeline showing Will's claimed business trips versus his actual locations, with GPS data and photographic evidence documenting each deception. This timeline covers the past 8 months, I explained, my voice steady and professional. The blue entries show where Will claimed to be for work purposes. The red entries show where he actually was, based on credit card transactions, GPS data from his phone, and photographic evidence from social media. The family stared at the screen in stunned silence as the scope of Will's deception became clear. Every supposed business trip had been a lie, every emergency meeting had been a romantic getaway, every professional conference had been a cover for his affair. But that's just the beginning, I continued, advancing to the next slide. What I discovered next was even more shocking. The screen now displayed a comprehensive breakdown of Will's expense reports, color-coded to show legitimate business expenses versus fraudulent claims. The fraudulent expenses were highlighted in red, and they dominated the presentation. Over the past 5 years, Will has submitted $127,000 in fraudulent expense reports to his employer, I announced. He's been stealing money from Medcore Solutions to fund his personal activities, including his relationship with Claudia. Uncle Dexter leaned forward in his chair, his business experience helping him understand the implications immediately. Will, is this true? Have you been embezzling money from your company? Will opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. He was overwhelmed by the comprehensive nature of the evidence, and the realization that his entire web of lies was unraveling simultaneously. I advanced to the next section of my presentation, revealing the network of vendors who had been complicit in Will's fraud scheme. The embezzlement wasn't just simple expense manipulation, I explained. Will had developed relationships with restaurant managers, hotel clerks, and conference organizers, who provided inflated receipts and fake documentation in exchange for guaranteed business. The screen showed a network diagram connecting Will to various businesses, with dollar amounts indicating how much each vendor had helped him steal. The complexity and sophistication of the fraud scheme shocked the family into deeper silence. For example, I continued, pointing to specific entries, Rosetti's restaurant would charge Will $200 for a dinner, but provide a receipt for $500, with Will pocketing the difference in cash. The Grandview Hotel would upgrade his rooms for free while charging his company premium rates. These weren't isolated incidents, they were systematic partnerships designed to facilitate theft. Anthony's voice was barely above a whisper when he asked, "How long has this been going on?" 5 years, I replied. Starting approximately 6 months after our wedding, I moved to the most emotionally devastating section of my presentation, how Will's crimes had affected his own family members. The screen displayed a series of transactions showing money that Will had borrowed or received from family members, contrasted with his theft from his employer. "Uncle Dexter," I said, addressing him directly, "you invested $15,000 in a commercial property based on Will's recommendation. Will told you he had insider knowledge about pharmaceutical company expansion plans. That information came from stolen corporate documents." Dexter's face went white as he realized the implications. "Cousin Marcus," I continued, "you borrowed $8,000 from Will for your daughter's college tuition. That money came directly from fraudulent expense reimbursements." The personal connections made the crimes feel more immediate and visceral for the family. Will hadn't just stolen from a faceless corporation, he'd used stolen money to manipulate his own relatives. The final section of my presentation revealed the most devastating truth of all: Will's comprehensive plan to abandon his family forever. The screen displayed apartment lease agreements, travel reservations, and financial transfers that documented his intention to disappear. Will has been planning to leave his job, liquidate his assets, and move to Charleston with Claudia, I announced. The apartment lease begins tomorrow. The financial transfers were scheduled to complete on Monday. This family reunion was intended to be his final goodbye, though none of you were supposed to know it. Julie Sr. gasped audibly. You were going to leave without telling us? I displayed the final piece of evidence, a series of text messages between Will and Claudia discussing their freedom and their plans for a new life together without the complications of Will's family obligations. With all the evidence displayed and explained, I turned to face Will directly. So when you say you need to leave for a work emergency, I said, my voice carrying across the silent gathering, what you really mean is that you're abandoning me at your family reunion to run away with your mistress, using money you've stolen from your employer to start a new life in another state. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Every family member was staring at Will, waiting for him to deny the accusations, to provide some explanation that would make sense of what they'd just learned. But Will said nothing. He stood in the center of the gathering, his shoulders slumped, his carefully maintained facade completely destroyed. The golden boy of the Bennett family had been revealed as a criminal, an adulterer, and a man planning to abandon everyone who loved him. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then the dam broke, and the family erupted in a chaos of shocked voices, angry questions, and emotional outbursts. How could you do this to Penelope? Julie Jr. demanded, her voice shaking with anger. How could you do this to us? Anthony added, his paternal authority transformed into profound disappointment. Spencer was staring at his brother with an expression of complete bewilderment. Will, what the hell were you thinking? Grandma Bennett, the family matriarch whose approval Will had always cherished, looked as if she'd been physically struck. I don't understand, she said quietly. This isn't the grandson I raised. Finally, Will found his voice, but his words only made the situation worse. You don't understand, he said desperately. It's complicated. The marriage, things haven't been right between Penelope and me for a long time. And the company money, I was going to pay it back. His explanations sounded pathetic even to him. The evidence was too comprehensive, the planning too elaborate, the deception too systematic for any of his usual charm to work. Pay it back with what money? Uncle Dexter demanded. You just showed us you were planning to disappear to another state. And what about our family? Julie Sr. asked, tears streaming down her face. Were you really going to vanish without saying goodbye, without explaining anything? Will had no answer for these questions, because there was no answer that could justify what he'd done. He'd been caught completely, and everyone in his family now understood exactly who he really was. The golden boy had fallen, and there was no way back up. Will's admission that everything I'd revealed was true triggered an immediate explosion of emotions from the Bennett family. The careful composure that had characterized the family meeting completely shattered as the reality of his betrayal sank in. Julie Sr. was the first to completely break down, sobbing as she looked at the son she thought she knew. How could you plan to leave us forever without saying goodbye? She cried. We're your family, Will. We love you unconditionally, and you were just going to disappear. Anthony's reaction was cold fury rather than tears. His face had turned red with anger as he stood up from his chair, pointing an accusatory finger at Will. You used our family name, he said, his voice shaking with rage. You took our love, our trust, our support, and you turned it into a cover story for criminal activity. Spencer was pacing back and forth behind the chairs, running his hands through his hair as he processed the information. I can't believe this, he kept repeating. I can't believe my own brother was planning to steal money and abandon his family. What kind of person does that? Uncle Dexter had moved beyond shock into practical damage assessment mode. Will, do you understand that you've made your entire family potential accessories to federal crimes? He demanded. Every family member who received money from you, every relative who provided you with alibis for your supposed business trips, were all potentially implicated in your fraud scheme. Cousin Marcus was staring at his evidence packet with the expression of someone who'd just learned he had a terminal illness. My daughter's college tuition, he said quietly. I told her how proud I was that Uncle Will was helping us out when we needed it most. That money was stolen from his company. Aunt Patricia was focused on a different aspect of the betrayal. All those family gatherings where you bragged about your success, she said to Will, her voice bitter with disappointment. All those times we held you up as an example to the younger cousins. You were lying to us about everything. The most heartbreaking reaction came from Grandma Bennett, whose relationship with Will had always been special. She sat in her chair looking frail and confused, as if the revelation had aged her 10 years in 10 minutes. I bragged about you to everyone at the senior center, she said, her voice barely audible. I told them how proud I was of my successful grandson, how you represented everything the Bennett family stood for. I told them you were proof that hard work and moral character still mattered in this world. Her words seemed to hit Will harder than all the anger and accusations from other family members. For the first time since the confrontation began, he showed genuine remorse rather than self-preservation. As the emotional shock began to wear off, family members started asking practical questions about the consequences of Will's actions. Uncle Dexter, with his business background, was the first to address the legal implications. Will, you need to understand that this isn't just a family matter anymore, he said grimly. Wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, these are federal crimes. When your company discovers what you've done, this will become a criminal investigation. Anthony nodded agreement. And every family member who received money from you will need to document those transactions for the authorities. We're all going to be questioned about our knowledge of your activities. The realization that their beloved family reunion was about to become evidence in a federal criminal case added another layer of devastation to an already overwhelming situation. Throughout the family's explosive reactions, Will remained largely silent. He'd initially tried to offer weak explanations and justifications, but the comprehensive nature of the evidence and the depth of his family's shock had apparently convinced him that damage control was impossible. He stood in the center of the gathering like a man awaiting execution, occasionally opening his mouth as if to speak, but then closing it again without saying anything. The confident, charming Will Bennett, who'd been the family's golden boy, had completely disappeared, replaced by someone who looked broken and defeated. The silence from the man who'd always had an answer for everything was perhaps the most convincing proof of his guilt. If there had been any innocent explanation for the evidence I'd presented, Will certainly would have offered it. His inability to defend himself spoke louder than any confession. As I watched the Bennett family process the complete destruction of their trust in Will, I realized that we'd crossed a point of no return. This wasn't a family crisis that could be resolved with apologies and promises to do better. Will's systematic betrayal had permanently altered the family's dynamics and relationships. The reunion that was supposed to celebrate family unity had instead become the moment when they learned that their unity had been built on lies. The weekend that should have strengthened their bonds had instead revealed that one of their most loved members had been planning to abandon them forever. There would be no recovery from this revelation, no path back to the way things used to be. Will Bennett had destroyed his family relationships as thoroughly as he'd destroyed his marriage and his career. As the emotional chaos began to settle into grim reality, Anthony took control of the situation with the authority that had made him the family patriarch. This family needs to make some decisions, he announced, his voice carrying across the gathering. Will has betrayed not just Penelope, but all of us. We need to decide how we're going to handle this going forward. The family had unconsciously formed a circle around Will, who remained standing in the center like a defendant awaiting sentencing. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The golden boy who had once been the center of family pride was now literally surrounded by the people he'd deceived. First, Anthony continued, we need to decide whether Will is welcome at future family gatherings. I'm calling for a family vote. All in favor of permanently excluding Will from Bennett family events, raise your hand. The response was immediate and unanimous. Every adult hand went up without hesitation. Even Julie Sr., despite her tears, raised her hand to vote against her own son. The message was clear. Will's betrayal had been so comprehensive that there was no path to redemption within the family structure. The vote is unanimous, Anthony announced. Will Bennett, you are no longer welcome at Bennett family gatherings. You have forfeited your right to be part of this family through your own choices. Uncle Dexter stood up to address the practical implications of Will's crimes. Every family member who received money from Will needs to understand that those funds were stolen, he said grimly. We're going to need to coordinate with authorities to document these transactions and potentially return the money to Will's employer. The financial reckoning was staggering. Marcus would need to repay his daughter's college tuition. Spencer would have to return his moving expenses. Aunt Patricia would need to surrender the expensive jewelry Will had given her. Multiple family members had unknowingly become recipients of stolen money. We'll work together to handle this properly, Anthony assured the family. We'll contact attorneys tomorrow to ensure we're protected legally and that we cooperate fully with any investigation. The practical consequences of Will's crimes would affect the Bennett family for years to come, but they were unified in their determination to handle the situation with integrity, the very quality that Will had abandoned. Spencer approached his brother with car keys in hand. "I'll drive you back to Atlanta tonight," he said, his voice cold and formal. "But this is the last favor I'll ever do for you. After tonight you're not my brother anymore." The finality in Spencer's voice seemed to break something in Will. For the first time since the confrontation began, he showed genuine emotion, not self-pity or anger, but what appeared to be genuine remorse for what he'd lost. "Spencer, please," Will said, reaching toward his brother. "I know I've made mistakes, but mistakes," Spencer cut him off. "You call 5 years of systematic fraud and planning to abandon your family mistakes. You call betraying everyone who ever loved you a mistake." Spencer turned away from Will without waiting for an answer. The rejection was absolute and final. As Will gathered his belongings under the watchful eyes of his former family, a new dynamic began to emerge. The Bennett family would survive his betrayal, but they would be forever changed by it. The innocence and trust that had characterized their relationships was gone, replaced by a harder wisdom about human nature. Julie Sr. approached me with tears in her eyes. "Penelope, I want you to know that you'll always be part of this family, regardless of what happens with Will. You've shown more integrity and courage than he ever did." Her words were echoed by other family members, who made it clear that their loyalty lay with the victim of Will's betrayal, rather than with Will himself. The family was choosing sides, and Will had chosen his side long ago. As Spencer's car pulled out of the driveway with Will in the passenger seat, the Bennett family stood together watching their former golden boy disappear into the darkness. There was no sadness in their farewell, only the grim satisfaction of having removed a cancer from their midst. "Well," Anthony said finally, "I think this reunion is officially over." But as the family began the process of packing up and preparing to leave, there was a sense that something important had happened. The truth had been revealed, justice had been served, and the family had proven that their values meant more to them than their loyalty to any individual member. Will Bennett was gone, but the Bennett family would endure. 6 months later, I stood in my new apartment overlooking the Atlanta skyline, a cup of coffee in my hands, and a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The divorce had been finalized within 60 days. Will didn't contest anything, knowing that fighting would only expose him to additional criminal liability. He'd plea bargained his federal charges down to 3 years in prison, forfeiting all assets to pay restitution to his employer. The Bennett family had rallied around me in ways I never expected. Julie Sr. called me every week to check in. Anthony and Uncle Dexter had helped me move and set up my new life. Spencer had become the protective brother I'd never had. They'd made it clear that Will's banishment didn't extend to me. I was still family, perhaps more so now than when I'd actually been married to their son. My forensic investigation business had exploded after word spread about my comprehensive exposure of Will's crimes. Lawyers throughout Georgia were referring clients to me, impressed by the thoroughness and professionalism of my work. I'd hired 2 assistants and was considering opening a second office. The irony wasn't lost on me that Will's betrayal had inadvertently launched my career into a new stratosphere. His attempt to destroy my life had instead revealed capabilities I didn't know I possessed, and opened doors I hadn't known existed. More importantly, I'd discovered who I was when I wasn't defined by being Will's wife. The shy, accommodating woman who'd spent 6 years making excuses for her husband's behavior had been replaced by someone confident, independent, and unwilling to accept less than she deserved. I'd started dating again carefully, with the wisdom that comes from having been thoroughly deceived once. But I was no longer afraid of trusting people. I'd learned to verify trust through evidence rather than assuming it through hope. The Bennett family had emerged stronger from Will's betrayal. They'd proven that their values meant more to them than their loyalty to any individual family member. The next reunion, held just 3 months after Will's exposure, had been smaller but more genuine. The artificial perfection was gone, replaced by authentic relationships built on actual knowledge of each other. As I reflected on the journey from discovering Will's first lie to watching him disappear from all our lives, I realized the most important lesson wasn't about betrayal or revenge. It was about the quiet strength that comes from refusing to be diminished by someone else's choices. Will had underestimated me for 6 years, seeing me as a convenient cover story for his crimes rather than as a person capable of exposing them. His fatal error wasn't just moral, it was strategic. He'd married his own worst nightmare, and never realized it. Sometimes the quiet ones are quiet because they're busy building evidence, and sometimes when people finally speak up, the whole world listens. The Bennett family reunion photos from that August weekend told a story that no one could have anticipated. In the end, the truth didn't just set me free, it revealed exactly who everyone really was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.